Israel crossed a line it should never have crossed. And as the old saying goes, the one who does the deed may forget it, but the one who suffers it never does. Perhaps at this moment, Israel believed it was over and done with, that the moment had passed. But Russia does not forget. For the first time in this war, consequences are now in motion. An ultimatum has arrived from the Kremlin. If you find this analysis valuable, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel right now and activate the notification bell so you never miss another conversation like this one. Share this video with anyone you believe needs to understand what the Western media is not reporting. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Your city, your country, your location tells me that this conversation is reaching the places it must reach. And please give this video a like, because that gesture alone helps an enormous number of additional people discover these geopolitical analyses that through the major media channels they would simply never find. Several days ago, in the midst of the deepening chaos of this war, a period marked by Israeli bombardments that showed no apparent restraint, striking targets in every direction, it emerged that Israel had bombed a Russian asset. The official framing was predictable, a preemptive strike, but I want to be direct about something. For Russia, there is no such thing as a preemptive strike that is then simply forgotten. The practice of striking and moving on, of cutting the grass and resuming normal relations the next morning does not apply to Vladimir Putin. Benjamin Netanyahu appears to have forgotten that he was no longer dealing with an Iranian asset in isolation. He was dealing with an asset, Discover More document translation service, external monitors, Chrome extensions, productivity, inside the port of Anzali on the Caspian Sea, a port where Russia has significant operational, commercial, and military interests. Multiple journalistic sources have confirmed the essential facts. The target of the Israeli Defense Forces was Iranian naval infrastructure, but that Iranian naval infrastructure happened to be located in Anzali. And Anzali is not simply an Iranian port in the conventional sense of the word. Analyzed geopolitically, Anzali is the principal logistical node connecting Iran to Russia across that entire region. It is where Russian vessels call, where cargo is transferred, where the economic and strategic scenes between Moscow and Tehran are most visibly joined. And in this particular attack, the United States did not participate. Washington, for once, kept itself at a careful distance. What Israel has just done is the geopolitical equivalent of Ukraine attacking Crimea. Iran is not Russian territory, of course, but that port is a bridge that directly connects Iran to Russia in that region. The Kremlin has invested enormously in that corridor, which it regards as a critical north-south commercial artery. Moscow and Tehran have developed it over many years precisely to circumvent Western sanctions, to evade the very American sanctions that not even the White House itself had dared to strike at directly. Netanyahu decided to strike anyway. He attacked the port where Russian ships dock, where cargoes are transferred. It is argued that those cargoes included weapons. I do not doubt it for an instant. Why would Russia not supply arms to Iran, its ally? It is the same logic by which the United States supplies bombs to Israel. Bombs that are used to kill civilians in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iran. The logical structure is identical. The difference is that Anzali is not simply a weapons transfer point. It is one of the principal ports through which Russian grain moves to crucial markets. According to multiple reports, military equipment, including the drones that Russia has used so systematically against Ukrainian infrastructure, also moves through that corridor. Russia's military supply chain for its conflict in Ukraine depends in part on that route, and Netanyahu found it simple to bomb it. Simple because from his perspective, he was severing Russia's drone supply line to Iran. But this is not something Russia will permit to pass without consequence. This is not a matter of arriving, delivering a blow, and departing the next morning as though nothing happened. Russia is not Iran. Russia is not Palestine. Striking an installation where Russia has operational, economic, and military interests is qualitatively different from anything Israel has done before in this conflict. This is genuinely new. This deserves a different kind of conversation because Israel had never crossed that particular line before. Russia's response arrived faster than Israel expected, and it came in language that was unusually severe. I want to be clear about what I observed. The consequences for Israel are already beginning to materialize, and I want to mark this moment in the record. In a matter of days, we will see whether what I am analyzing here is confirmed. The spokesperson for Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Zakharova, who is exceptionally close to Vladimir Putin, was the one who issued the formal declaration. When Zakharova speaks in this register, it is practically as though Putin himself wrote the words. She stated personally that Israel's attack was reckless and irresponsible. And she issued a formal warning that these kinds of actions will expand the conflict, that Russia will not stand with its arms folded, and that it will not forget what happened. She stated explicitly that this conflict will expand toward the states of the Caspian Sea. Let us pause on that declaration and examine it carefully. Who are the states of the Caspian Sea? Russia is one of them. Zakharova did not limit herself to a personal warning. This was a formal statement on behalf of the Russian state, declaring that Israel's attack directly affects Russia's economic and military interests, particularly its commerce in food with Iran. It is something that Russia will not forgive, and I return to the point I made earlier. Not even the United States, a first-rate military power, had dared to touch that corridor. What strikes me as especially revealing is that the Western media has barely reported any of this. One asks with good reason why this does not appear on the major television networks on this side of the world. In Russian media, in Iranian media, in Turkish and Chinese coverage, it appears prominently. Here it does not. And that silence is itself part of the problem I've been pointing to for years, the inability of major Western media institutions to report with rigor on geopolitical dynamics that do not fit comfortably within the dominant narrative. I have observed this pattern across decades of journalism, and it remains one of the most consequential failures of our public discourse. What Zakharova issued was in essence an ultimatum to Israel delivered in the name of Vladimir Putin and the Russian state. An ultimatum that says, in its substance, continue doing this and you will drag all the countries of the Caspian Sea into this conflict. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, two nations that export massively to global markets and depend on that sea as their primary commercial artery. That is what Israel is putting at risk with these reckless actions. It is worth understanding why the Caspian Sea carries that particular strategic weight. The Caspian is not an open sea. It is technically a closed lake enclosed by Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia has been extraordinarily protective of that zone. It has maintained a clear policy. The Caspian was a zone of peace, of tacit cooperation among its littoral states. No one interfered there. No one disturbed that equilibrium until Israel decided to launch a strike into that space. The Caspian had been untouched by the current wave of conflict. When one examines the map with care, the scale of the provocation becomes even more evident. The Israeli attack on Anzali occurred at a considerable distance from the recognized zone of conflict near the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. This was not collateral damage. This was not a missile that lost its course. It was a deliberate strike against a zone that is, geopolitically speaking, the sovereign domain of the Caspian's littoral states. Israel is not one of those states. Any external military operation in that space is considered a direct violation of the understanding that has governed the region. Israel understood this and it acted anyway. That is what is genuinely grave here. Netanyahu could not have been ignorant of the nature of that port. He cannot claim ignorance. The decision was made with full knowledge of what Anzali represents. And that decision reveals something important about the current state of Israeli strategic calculation. There's a willingness to disregard all red lines, including those that directly border on Russian interests. Israel lacks the real capacity to destroy Anzali permanently. Available satellite imagery shows a port with many kilometers of docks, grain warehouses, container terminals, and joint military installations with Iran. An airstrike can damage buildings, can destroy some ships, including Russian ships, but it cannot render an entire port inoperable. It cannot close Anzali. And even if it could achieve that, Iran and Russia have other ports available on the Caspian. The Caspian Sea is enormous. They have alternative options toward Turkmenistan, toward other specialized grain terminals. Israel cannot strike all of those points simultaneously. What then is the real objective? From my perspective, grounded in decades of observing how great powers actually behave, the objective is not the destruction of Russian-Iranian logistics. The objective is to send a message to the Kremlin and to maintain pressure on Iran. But in that calculation, Israel is not measuring the consequences correctly. Because if the attack had directly damaged a Russian vessel, if it had caused Russian casualties on the ground, we would already be speaking in entirely different terms. We would be speaking of an escalation with unpredictable consequences. Israel knows that, and it did not care enough to stop at the line. There is an additional piece of context that is fundamental for understanding the full picture. Some months ago, Russia offered Iran a mutual defense treaty following the same model it had already signed with North Korea, a treaty establishing that if one party is attacked, the other is obligated to intervene militarily, a kind of NATO between them, what Washington calls the axis of evil. Under that framework, North Korea already operates beneath the Russian nuclear umbrella. That is why North Korean soldiers have appeared fighting alongside Russian troops. That is why Kim Jong-un celebrated the signing of that agreement, because it meant that his country's international isolation had been formally broken. That was the level of commitment Russia extended to Iran, and Throne said no. The faction within the Iranian parliament that still believed in the possibility of an agreement with the West rejected the offer. They preferred to maintain some distance from Moscow, not to be completely bound to the Russian sphere, not to owe the Kremlin that kind of debt. And now, after everything that is unfolding, Israel is showing Iran exactly what that decision has caused. Iran today stands without formal protection exposed to Israeli attacks, while Russia observes without any legal obligation to respond until Israel touched the Caspian Sea. That is what changed the equation. Israel knows that Iran does not have a nuclear umbrella. It knows that Russia has no legal obligation to defend Iran because no mutual defense treaty exists. It knows it can strike Iranian installations without triggering an automatic Russian military response. And that is precisely what it has been doing. But by attacking Anzali, it moved into different terrain. Terrain where Russian interests are directly engaged, where Russian infrastructure exists, where Russian assets are genuinely at stake. If Israel continues attacking Russian interests, if it continues touching Kremlin assets, Russia does not need to enter the conflict directly. It is sufficient for Russia to say to Iran, here is the armament. Do with it what you will. Supplies, technology, not necessarily the most advanced generation. There are many ways Russia can respond without firing a single missile from Russian territory. Russia can close Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft, something it has not yet done. Despite Israel's constant bombardments in Syria, Russia can deliver its most advanced anti-aircraft systems to Hezbollah, which would render northern Israel practically inoperable with Russian S-300 systems. That is already a plausible reality. And at a more extreme level, if tensions continue to escalate, Russia could begin delivering missile technology to Iran through undeclared channels. I confess I am somewhat surprised that has not already occurred, given that Iran had rejected the Mutual Defense Pact. But after these attacks on the Caspian, I am convinced that Iran will turn back to Russia and sign that treaty. I am certain of it. There is a north-south corridor connecting the Indian Ocean to the Caspian Sea and on to northern Europe, one of the most important alternative commercial routes in the world. And something that is not discussed nearly enough is that any disruption of that corridor would harm Europe enormously. The Caspian represents one of the very few zones where Russian and European interests genuinely coincide. Any escalation among the Caspian states will directly affect the flow of oil and gas upon which European economies depend. That is why Zakharova speaks of consequences for all the Caspian states. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, nations that export massively to global markets and use that sea as their primary commercial artery. What we are observing in Israel is not an act of strength. It is an act of desperation. The myth of the invincible Israeli military has shattered in Gaza and Lebanon and the Red Sea. Gaza has become a genuine quagmire where Israeli casualties continue to mount. The Israeli economy is in decline. The deterrent capacity they sold to the world for so long, the celebrated Iron Dome, is no longer presented as infallible. The same pattern is repeating with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel is inflicting a brutal toll. But Lebanon has also caused Israel significant losses and demonstrated that northern Israel is deeply vulnerable. The Houthis and Yemen have effectively closed the Red Sea to Israeli interests. And now Israel has opened a conflict in the Caspian. Israel has methodically generated conflicts across every significant maritime corridor and front: the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and now the Caspian Sea. Through every route, through every front, through every direct attack from Iran that has penetrated supposedly impenetrable defenses. What Israel is doing now is attacking supply chains with the consequence that it is enclosing itself within a ring of its own making. And the price of those actions is not paid by Israel alone. It is paid by every country in the Persian Gulf. It is paid by all of Europe, which depends on the energy transit of the Gulf for its economic sustenance. When a country possessing nuclear weapons begins attacking installations belonging to a country that possesses many more nuclear weapons, one must be very clear about who is who on that board. The country with the greatest number of nuclear warheads in the world is Russia. The second is the United States. Israel has nuclear warheads, but not a third of what Russia possesses. Not a third. The calculation being made in Jerusalem is profoundly mistaken. I believe the assumption in Jerusalem was that they could maintain a safe distance from Russia while doing in the Caspian what they routinely do in the Middle East, what they so casually call mowing the grass. No, they were wrong. That is not how Russian geopolitics functions. For the Kremlin, there is no mowing the grass and starting fresh the next morning. Alliances are signed or they do not exist. And I assure you, the collateral consequence for Israel from all of this is that Iran will seek the alliance Russia proposed 2 years ago. The very alliance Thrawn rejected. That is going to happen one day when least expected, those S-300 systems will appear in Lebanon. When that occurs, we will remember this conversation because it is precisely on account of these attacks on the Caspian Sea that Zakharova declared clearly, continue on this path and you will bring all the Caspian states, including Russia, down upon you. And when those systems arrive in Lebanon, the Artiso rockets will be a memory of a simpler time. And and Mainsan, that is the scenario Israel is constructing with every reckless action. That is what they are provoking with every strike that crosses another line. Russia will not enter this war directly. Do not expect that. What Russia will do is sell or even gift arms to Lebanon, if only to keep Israel occupied on that front so that it does not carry the war further toward the Caspian. The logic is internally consistent and strategically sound. The great powers remain great powers precisely because they act in the service of their interests. And the problem here is that Israel is now touching Russian interests. That is an entirely different story from anything that came before. If you do not touch Russia, Russia was not going to intervene to save anyone. That is the reality of geopolitics, a reality I have observed across 4 decades of writing about power, constitutions, and the behavior of nations. The moment Israel decided to cross that line in the Caspian, it changed the fundamental nature of its relationship with Moscow. And those consequences are ones we are only beginning to see unfold. This is precisely the kind of analysis that the Western media does not produce. Not because I am discovering something previously unknown. The facts are available to any journalist willing to look, but because the major communications media on this side of the world simply do not discuss these dynamics, they do not fit the narrative. And I believe it is essential that someone does discuss them. More than essential, I believe it is our responsibility as informed citizens to demand this kind of intellectual rigor from those who cover these conflicts. The health of a free society depends upon citizens who insist on lucid analysis rather than comforting fictions. If you have stayed with me through this entire analysis, I ask you once more, share this video, give it a like, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. This conversation matters. The more people who engage with it, the better equipped we will all be to understand the world in which we live, a world that deserves far more honest analysis than it typically receives.